You think you know how Joan of Arc died? The flames, the stake, the 19-year-old peasant girl who crowned a king, crying Jesus as fire consumed her, but nobody talks about what happened next. The 24 hours that followed her execution on May 30th, 1431, hours when a severed heart refused to burn, when ashes were thrown into the Seine twice more because one burning wasn't enough, when witnesses started whispering the word martyrdom, when an executioner began to fear for his soul. What actually happened in the day after Joan died? May 30th, 1431, 8 in the morning, Rouen's old marketplace. Joan of Arc stands on a scaffold built deliberately too high. Executioner Geoffroy Terrage has done this job for 25 years, but something is different today. The platform towers above the crowd, placing Joan beyond his reach, beyond the mercy of a quick strangling before the flames. The English want her to suffer. Terrage lights the pyre. Joan calls out for Jesus. The fire catches. Witnesses watch from below as smoke rises, carrying her voice across the marketplace. Jean Massieu, the court usher who had led Joan to trial session after session, stands frozen. Guillaume Manchon, the chief notary who had recorded every word of her testimony, feels something shift. Pierre Cousquel, the master mason, sees the woman who had liberated Orléans consumed by English flames. The fire burns for over an hour. When it dies down, Terrage rakes through the ashes. His job isn't finished. He finds Joan's heart intact among the charred remains, unburned, whole. The executioner stares at what the flames couldn't touch. This is where the nightmare begins. Cardinal Winchester orders a second burning. The heart must be destroyed. No relics can remain. Terrage rebuilds the pyre. More wood, hotter flames. The heart goes back into the fire. It emerges untouched. A third burning follows. 3 attempts to destroy what the English believe holds heretical power. 3 failures. If you value documented medieval history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the rehabilitation trial transcripts compiled by Jules Quicherat in 1841 to 1849, as well as the original trial notary records by Guillaume Manchon held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. These are not secondary interpretations, but direct witness testimonies recorded within 25 years of the events, including detailed receipts for Geoffroy Terrage's work preserved in the B&F archives dating from 1432. Now, back to the information. Terrage sweeps Joan's ashes into a wooden bucket. The executioner who had burned 104 French soldiers at this same marketplace just 1 year later walks to the Mathilde Bridge spanning the Seine. He tips the bucket. Ash and bone fragments scatter on the water, carried downstream toward Paris. The English believe they have erased Joan of Arc from existence. They are wrong. Word spreads through Rouen within hours. The woman they called the Maid of Orléans is dead, but something isn't right. The witnesses can't stop talking about the heart, about the 3 burnings, about the way Joan forgave her accusers before the flames. Citizens begin using a word that terrifies the English occupation: martyrdom. Guillaume Manchon returns to his quarters near Rouen Cathedral. The notary who had faithfully recorded Joan's trial testimony for 5 months can't sleep. He had watched Pierre Cochon manipulate evidence, threaten witnesses, twist Joan's words. Now he had watched her die, 25 years later. Manchon will testify that the trial was corrupted from the start, that Joan never received proper counsel, that the English controlled every aspect of the proceedings. But on this night, Manchon writes nothing. The official record ends with Joan's death sentence. What happens next will remain buried for decades. Jean Massieu, the usher, wanders the empty streets. The man who had escorted Joan from cell to courtroom for months remembers her final request. She had asked to see a cross as she died. An English soldier, moved by her courage, had fashioned one from sticks. Joan kissed it, placed it against her chest. Massieu had fetched a processional crucifix from Saint-Sauveur Church. He held it high so she could see it through the flames. The Dominican friars Martin Ladvenu and Isambart de la Pierre don't return to their monastery. They walk the ramparts of Rouen, processing what they witnessed. Joan had made her confession that morning. She received communion despite church law forbidding sacraments to heretics. The friars had consoled her at the stake, shouting assurances of salvation above the roar of flames. Now they question everything. Pierre Cochon, Bishop of Beauvais, retreats to his chambers. The architect of Joan's trial has achieved his goal. The woman who crowned Charles VII is dead. The English have paid him well for his services. But Cochon notices something troubling. The people of Rouen aren't celebrating. They're whispering, pointing. Some cross themselves when they see him pass. The executioner Geoffroy Terrage sits alone in a tavern near the marketplace. The man who had efficiently dispatched criminals for 25 years stares at his hands. He confides to two clergymen that he fears for his soul. The heart that wouldn't burn haunts him. He believes he has killed a holy woman. Terrage will never speak publicly about Joan's execution, but his fear spreads through Rouen like smoke. Midnight approaches. The city settles into uneasy quiet. English guards patrol the streets, ensuring order, but they can't patrol thoughts. Can't silence whispers. Can't stop the growing belief that they have murdered a saint. Cardinal Winchester writes dispatches to London. The mission is complete. Joan of Arc is dead. The threat to English control of France has been eliminated. But Winchester omits crucial details. The heart. The three burnings. The crowd's reaction. The way Joan died blessing her executioners. Charles VII, the king Joan had crowned at Reims, receives news of her death 2 days later at his court in Chinon. The monarch who never attempted her rescue feels what chroniclers describe as bitter grief. He promises terrible vengeance against the English, but Charles knows the truth. His crown rests on the actions of a convicted heretic. Joan's death creates a political crisis that will haunt his reign. By dawn on May 31st, the immediate physical evidence is gone. The scaffold has been dismantled, the ashes scattered, the marketplace swept clean, but the psychological aftermath is just beginning. Guillaume Manchon begins hearing confessions from other trial participants. Men who had remained silent during Joan's prosecution now express doubts. Jean Toumouillet whispers that they persecuted her from perverse revenge. Guillaume Duval admits the English manipulated everything. Pierre Miget, one of the judges, privately questions the verdict. The rehabilitation of Joan of Arc begins 24 hours after her death. Merchants arriving in Rouen for market day find a changed city. The woman who had broken the English siege of Orléans is gone, but her legend grows stronger. Pilgrims begin arriving at the execution site. They collect fragments of wood from the scaffold, scraps of rope, anything touched by Joan's presence. The English issue orders forbidding such activities. They post guards at the marketplace, but they cannot guard memory. Jean Massieu walks to Joan's former cell in Bouvreuil Castle. The chamber where she had been chained to a wooden block for 5 months stands empty. Iron rings embedded in stone walls remain as evidence of her captivity. Massieu remembers how Joan complained that English guards attempted to assault her, how she wore male clothing for protection, how Cochon threatened him for showing her small kindnesses. The usher makes a decision that will echo through history. He begins memorizing details, names, dates, conversations, evidence that will prove crucial when Joan's case is reopened. Geoffroy Terrage returns to the execution site. The scaffold is gone, but burn marks scar the cobblestones. The executioner stares at the spot where Joan died, the woman who had claimed divine visions, who had liberated Orleans, who had crowned a king, who had forgiven her executioners with her final breath. Terrage kneels on the charred stones, a hardened professional who had killed for 3 monarchs, Charles VI of France, Henry V of England, Henry VI of England, breaks down. He prays for Joan's soul and for his own forgiveness. Word reaches Paris by evening. The University of Paris, which had demanded Joan's trial, celebrates her death. These academics had provided theological justification for her execution. They had drafted articles of accusation. They had declared her visions demonic. Now they proclaim victory over heresy. But even in Paris, doubts surface. Jean Gerson, the influential theologian, had defended Joan's right to wear male clothing. He had argued her mission was legitimate. Gerson died in 1429, but his writings survive. His supporters begin circulating them quietly. The crack in the English narrative widens. Dominican monasteries across Normandy receive disturbing reports from Ladvenu and de la Pierre. The friars describe Joan's piety, her final confession, the way she blessed her enemies, the heart that survived 3 burnings. Monastic communities begin questioning whether they witnessed an execution or a martyrdom. Prior to Joan's death, English propaganda had portrayed her as a sorceress, a heretic, a threat to Christendom. Now that propaganda collides with eyewitness testimony, the woman who died in Rouen marketplace bore little resemblance to the monster described in English pamphlets. Reality defeats propaganda. Truth spreads faster than official denials. Terrage visits the Dominican friars at their monastery. The executioner confesses his growing terror. He describes the heart that wouldn't burn, the 3 failed attempts at destruction, his certainty that Joan was innocent. The friars listen without judgment. They share his fears. The man who lit Joan's pyre becomes the first witness to her sanctity. By dawn on June 1st, 36 hours after execution, the pattern is clear. Those closest to Joan's death, the executioner, the notaries, the ushers, the friars, expressed the strongest doubts about her guilt. The further one was from the actual events, the easier it becomes to maintain official fiction. Truth spreads in concentric circles from Rouen's marketplace. English administrators recognize the problem. Joan was supposed to die as a discredited heretic. Instead, she dies as a martyr. Her execution, designed to destroy her legacy, transforms her into a saint. The English have created their greatest enemy. They begin planning damage control. Cardinal Winchester commissions new propaganda, pamphlets describing Joan as a witch, stories claiming her heart burned completely, denials of miraculous preservation, but these lies arrive too late. Eyewitness accounts have already spread beyond English control. The truth has 24 hours head start. Cauchon summons his inner circle for an emergency meeting. The bishop who prosecuted Joan faces uncomfortable questions. Why did her heart survive 3 burnings? Why did she die blessing her executioners? Why are Rouen citizens calling her a martyr? The prosecution team, so confident during Joan's trial, now struggles with doubt. The evidence that seemed overwhelming in the courtroom appears less certain in hindsight. Joan's responses, which they had interpreted as heretical, now seem prophetic. She had warned them. She had said her judges might be in greater danger than she was. The warning echoes through Cauchon's chambers. Manchon begins documenting irregularities in Joan's trial. The chief notary records conversations that were omitted from official transcripts, threats against witnesses, English interference, manipulated evidence. This secret documentation will prove crucial during Joan's rehabilitation trial 25 years later. The paper trail of corruption begins immediately after Joan's death. Guillaume Cole, another notary, corroborates Manchon's account. The men who faithfully recorded Joan's words during her trial now record the truth about her prosecution. They detail how English gold corrupted the proceedings, how witnesses were intimidated, how evidence was suppressed. The men who documented Joan's conviction begin documenting her innocence. Citizens of Rouen seek out trial participants, demanding explanations. The judges and notaries find themselves on trial in public opinion. Some, like Jean Beaupère, remain defiant. Others, like Guillaume Manchon, begin questioning their role in Joan's death. The city that executed Joan begins putting her executioners on trial. Reports reach other French cities. Orléans, which Joan had liberated, erupts in grief and rage. Citizens who remembered her courage at their siege demand vengeance against her English killers. The political implications become clear. Joan's martyrdom will fuel French resistance for decades. The English have created a rallying cry that will drive them from France. Burgundian allies of the English begin distancing themselves from Joan's execution. The Duke of Burgundy, who had sold her to the English, faces criticism from his own nobles. Some argue he should have protected her as a prisoner of war. Others claim he was deceived about English intentions. Joan's death begins fracturing the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. Merchants and travelers carry news beyond France. Italian city-states receive detailed accounts within a week. The Holy Roman Empire learns of Joan's execution within 2 weeks. Papal territories receive conflicting reports, English propaganda versus French witness testimony. Joan's death becomes an international scandal. Pierre Cauchon realizes his career depends on maintaining the fiction of Joan's guilt. The bishop who prosecuted her must now defend his verdict against growing skepticism. He begins gathering sworn statements from trial participants, attempting to create an official narrative. But too many witnesses know the truth. The executioner Geoffroy Terrage disappears from historical records after March 1432. His final documented payment was for executing 104 French soldiers who attempted to capture Rouen Castle. Whether he died, changed professions, or fled from guilt remains unknown. The man who burned Joan of Arc vanishes from history. Dominican friars begin collecting testimony about Joan's sanctity. Martin Ladvenu and Isambard de la Pierre interview witnesses to her piety. They document her final confession, her blessing of enemies, her courageous death. This documentation will form the foundation of her eventual canonization. The process of saint-making begins 48 hours after execution. English officials recognize they face a propaganda disaster. The woman they executed as a heretic is being venerated as a saint. Her death, intended to demoralize French resistance, instead energizes it. They order the suppression of all relics and the punishment of anyone spreading superstitious stories about Joan. The cover-up begins as soon as the crime is discovered. Guillaume Manchon receives visitors seeking the truth about Joan's trial. The chief notary who recorded her testimony becomes the unofficial keeper of her memory. He begins collecting sworn statements from other participants, creating a counter-narrative to English propaganda. The paper trail of Joan's innocence grows daily. By June 2nd, 72 hours after execution, the English position is untenable. Too many witnesses saw what happened. Too many questions remain unanswered. Too many people refuse to accept the official story. The heart that wouldn't burn has become a symbol of Joan's innocence. Cauchon adds a posthumous document to Joan's trial record 8 days after her death. This addendum claims Joan recanted her revelations and admitted deception before execution. But the timing is suspicious. The document appears nowhere in contemporary records. None of the notaries will sign it. The final lie in a trial built on lies? The pattern is now clear. Every aspect of Joan's prosecution was corrupt. Every piece of evidence was manipulated. Every witness was intimidated. The trial that was supposed to prove her guilt instead proves her innocence to anyone willing to examine the facts. Joan of Arc dies guilty on May 30th, 1431. She begins to be proven innocent within 24 hours of her death. The heart that survived 3 burnings becomes the symbol of truth that survives all attempts at destruction. The English thought they were executing a heretic. Instead, they martyred a saint. The rehabilitation of Joan of Arc does not wait for the cold formality of official proceedings. It ignites in the very embers of her pyre, a whispered rebellion in the smoke-choked streets of Rouen. It finds its voice in the hushed, frantic conversations between Dominican friars, their faces pale in the candlelight of their scriptorium. It takes root in the sleepless, sweat-soaked nights of notaries who recorded her defiant words, their own ink now feeling like a stain of complicity. It begins in the absolute, soul-shattering terror of an executioner who has seen the face of God in his victim and now fears eternal damnation. Within a single week, the English occupation faces a new kind of war. Their soldiers, hardened men of battle, report unnerving incidents at the execution site in the old marketplace. Citizens of Rouen, who were meant to be cowed into submission, instead kneel on the scorched cobblestones where Joan of Arc died. They are seen collecting blackened splinters from the hastily dismantled scaffold, treating them not as firewood but as relics. They whisper prayers where her ashes were unceremoniously swept into the Seine. The English authorities, in a surge of panicked authority, post guards around the clock and issue threats of imprisonment, but it is useless. The pilgrimage has begun before her body is even cold. The marketplace that witnessed her horrific death is already becoming a shrine. Jean Massieu, the bailiff, cannot escape the labyrinth of his own memory. The usher who had escorted Joan from the damp chill of her cell to the blazing horror in the marketplace on May 30th now walks those same stone corridors, but now they are haunted. Every shadow seems to hold her shape. He remembers with excruciating clarity her final, desperate request for a crucifix. He remembers how he, a minor functionary in her persecution, ran in a panic to the nearby church of Saint-Sauveur to fetch one. He remembers the searing heat on his face as he held it high above the rising wall of flames, a desperate beacon so she could see the image of her savior as she died. The woman who had liberated Orléans, the warrior Maid of France, had died blessing the very men who were murdering her. The memory is a fire in his own soul. In his locked study, Guillaume Manchon unseals his private notes, the papers rustling like guilty secrets in the silence. As the chief notary, he had meticulously recorded Joan's trial in French before translating the proceedings into the sterile, official Latin. But he knows, with a certainty that chills his blood, what he was forced to leave out. The open threats from English lords, the suffocating intimidation of witnesses, the cunning, insidious way Bishop Cochon had twisted doctrine and manipulated testimony. His original French minutes, hidden beneath a false floorboard, contain the unvarnished truth, evidence that will utterly destroy the verdict. But to publish them now would be a death sentence. So he hides the truth, his quill becoming a sword he sharpens in the dark, and he waits for safer times. Pierre Cosquel, the master mason who had been hired to construct the English fortifications, and who had watched Joan burn from a scaffold of his own making, begins to think with a craftsman's eye. He starts asking dangerous questions among his trusted apprentices. Why did the English command that the scaffold be built so unusually high, preventing the executioner from giving the customary mercy of a quick strangulation before the flames were lit? Why did they demand not 1, but 3 separate fires, feeding the pyre for hours to systematically destroy her body, her organs, and finally, her heart? Cuskel had taken English coin for years, a pragmatic man in a time of war, but Joan's execution changes everything. He begins to document the architectural irregularities of the execution site. He takes precise measurements. He quietly records the statements of other witnesses. The mason who helped build English power in Rouen begins, stone by stone, to collect the evidence that will tear it all down. The Dominican friars, Martin Ladvenu and Isambart de la Pierre, returned to their monastery as irrevocably changed men. They had stood at the base of the pyre, their own robes scorched by the heat, and consoled Joan in her final agony, shouting promises of paradise above the roar and crackle of the flames. They had witnessed her forgive her executioners with her dying breath. They had seen not a heretic meeting a just end, but a martyr ascending to heaven. The friars begin to write. These are not official reports, but dangerous. Unsanctioned accounts of Joan's sanctity, they compose letters to other monasteries across France, describing her pious death in detail. They send clandestine reports to contacts in Rome, questioning the canonical legitimacy of the trial. The official documentation of her sainthood begins within weeks of her execution, a counter-narrative born in the conviction of holy men. Jean Tumouillet, another Dominican who had attended the trial, whispers to his brothers during Vespers that they had not judged a heretic, but had persecuted a saint out of perverse, political revenge. Guillaume Duval, a fellow cleric, admits in the confessional that the English had manipulated everything from the start. Nicolas de Houppeville reveals to his closest friends that he was banished from Rouen by Cauchon himself for daring to question the proceedings. The carefully constructed conspiracy of silence begins to crumble as individual consciences, overwhelmed by guilt, break their bonds of fear. Truth emerges piece by piece from fractured souls. By June 15th, a mere 2 weeks after the execution, the English authorities in Rouen recognized the catastrophic scope of their miscalculation. The citizens are not celebrating the death of a witch, they are mourning the murder of a saint. Pilgrims are now arriving daily, not just from the city, but from the surrounding countryside, seeking relics or simply a place to pray. Local priests, under threat of punishment, refuse to preach the official sermons condemning her memory. Popular opinion has already canonized the woman they executed as a heretic. The damage control begins far too late. Cardinal Winchester, the chief English political power in France, commissions a new wave of propaganda pamphlets. Hired writers describe Joan as a cunning sorceress who deceived witnesses with demonic illusions. Commissioned artists depict her with grotesque, demonic features. Preachers are paid handsomely to denounce her from the pulpit as an agent of Satan, but the eyewitness testimony of hundreds overwhelms the manufactured lies. Truth, passed from mouth to ear in the markets and taverns, spreads faster and is far more compelling than state-sponsored propaganda. The people trust what they saw with their own eyes over what they are being told to believe. Guillaume Manchon receives a series of midnight visitors throughout the month of June. One by one, other participants from the trial seek him out, their faces etched with anxiety. They come to confess their doubts, their fears, their certainty of Joan's innocence. The chief notary becomes an unofficial confessor for men tortured by their role in a judicial murder. He listens patiently to their testimonies of coercion and fear, and, in the dead of night, he secretly records them. The evidence of the trial's profound corruption accumulates daily. The paper trail of her innocence grows in the darkness. Geoffroy Terrage cannot stop drinking. The executioner, a man who for 25 years had dispatched criminals with brutal efficiency, now tries to drown his guilt in casks of cheap ale. He tells anyone in the squalid taverns of Rouen who will listen about the heart that refused to burn. He babbles about his chilling certainty that he killed a holy woman. He cries aloud about his terror of divine retribution. His public breakdown becomes Rouen worst-kept secret, a living testament to the innocence of his most famous victim. The executioner's confession, raw and terrified, spreads through every tavern and inn. Charles VII, the king she had crowned, receives detailed reports about Joan's death and its aftermath by early July. Royal spies embedded in Rouen describe the execution, the failed attempts to incinerate her heart, and the rapidly growing veneration of her memory among the common people. The king, who had failed to rescue Joan, now faces the undeniable political consequences of her martyrdom. His crown, the very symbol of his legitimacy, now rests upon the testimony of a dead saint he abandoned. The political calculations become a moral and strategic nightmare. English military commanders notice an immediate and shocking change in the nature of French resistance. Soldiers who had previously feared the formidable English power now fight with a renewed, almost fanatical fury. They fight as if guided by an unseen hand. Towns that had meekly surrendered to English rule begin to plot rebellion. Joan's execution, a strategic act designed to shatter French morale, instead forges it into something unbreakable. Martyrdom proves to be a weapon far more powerful than any miracle she performed in life. By August, a mere 3 months after the execution, the transformation is undeniable. Joan of Arc has become the very thing the English feared most, a symbol of French resistance that cannot be killed, captured, or corrupted by mortal means. Her death transforms her from a charismatic but fallible military leader into a transcendent spiritual force. By trying to destroy her, the English have inadvertently created their own nemesis. Political murder becomes an act of political suicide. Pierre Cauchon, the ambitious bishop who prosecuted Joan, grows increasingly paranoid. He sees his carefully constructed legacy and reputation threatened by the whispers of doubt spreading even among his former allies. He issues written orders, sealed with his episcopal authority. forbidding any trial participant from discussing the proceedings under penalty of law. He threatens excommunication for anyone caught spreading what he calls false and seditious stories about Joan's supposed sanctity. Fear becomes his primary tool of control. But fear is a double-edged sword. Cauchon's frantic paranoia serves only as proof of his own guilt. Guillaume Cole, another notary from the trial, approaches Manchon with his own set of secret records. The two men who had once faithfully documented the official narrative of Joan's guilt now conspire to document the truth of her prosecution. They compare their notes, confirming details about direct English interference, witness intimidation, and the deliberate manipulation of evidence. Their combined testimony, hidden away, will eventually become the hammer that shatters Cauchon's reputation for all time. Truth finds its most powerful allies among the guilty and the penitent. Dominican monasteries across Normandy begin to act as clearinghouses for miracle accounts attributed to Joan's intercession. Sick pilgrims report sudden healings after praying at her execution site. Soldiers claim to have been miraculously protected in battle after invoking her name. Merchants describe unexpectedly successful ventures after seeking her blessing for their journeys. The grassroots documentation of miracles begins immediately after her death. Popular sainthood requires no papal approval. It is a verdict delivered by the faithful, Jean d'Estivée. The venomous prosecutor who had famously forbidden Joan from attending Massy dies violently within months of her execution. His body is found floating in a Rouen sewer. Whether it was suicide, murder by a French patriot, or an act of divine justice is unclear, and to the people of Rouen, irrelevant. His sordid end terrifies other trial participants, who see it as undeniable proof of God's vengeance against Joan's persecutors. Divine retribution, it seems, has arrived swiftly and very publicly. By Christmas of 1431, just 8 months after the execution, Joan's rehabilitation in the court of popular opinion is complete. Churches across France hold unofficial memorial services for her. Priests preach about her martyrdom, cleverly weaving her story into their sermons, despite official prohibitions. Artists begin to create illicit images of her sanctity, depicting her with a halo. Minstrels compose ballads celebrating her sacrifice. The woman who died a condemned heretic now lives as a beloved saint in the hearts of her people. Folk canonization precedes formal papal recognition by centuries. Italian merchants, traveling the trade routes, carry the news of Joan's execution throughout Europe. Venetian chroniclers write detailed accounts of the heart that would not burn. German traders report on the widespread French veneration of her memory. Spanish nobles, in letters to their king, question the legitimacy of a trial so blatantly controlled by a foreign power. Joan's martyrdom becomes an international scandal that severely damages English prestige and moral authority across all of Christendom. Truth travels much faster than propaganda. Papal officials in Rome, sensitive to the shifting political and spiritual winds, begin their own quiet inquiries into Joan's case by early 1432. The church authorities in the Vatican recognize the catastrophic possibility that they may have sanctioned the execution of a true saint. Cardinal legates are dispatched to discreetly request copies of the trial documents. Vatican lawyers, experts in canon law, begin to examine the proceedings for the manifest canonical irregularities. The process of rehabilitation begins in Rome, long before France makes any official request. The Church, in the end, always protects itself by protecting the truth. Guillaume Manchon faces increasing pressure to surrender his original French notes from Joan's trial. English officials offer him substantial bribes, which he refuses. They then threaten him with imprisonment and torture. Bishop Cauchon personally demands the documents, his voice a silken threat. But Manchon, clutching the truth that has become his life's purpose, refuses them all. He knows his notes contain the irrefutable proof of the trial's corruption. He continues to hide the truth and wait for the day of justice. Patient witnesses, he knows, become the most powerful testimony. By the spring of 1432, 1 year after the execution, the English military and political position in Normandy is becoming untenable. Military defeats are mounting across the region. Popular resistance, fueled by the legend of the martyred Maid, grows stronger with each passing day. Allied support from Burgundy begins to weaken. Joan's martyrdom provides the unifying and spiritual rallying cry that unites France against the English occupation. The woman they killed to break their resistance has instead become the force that will break their power. The executed has become their executioner. Geoffroy Terrage's name appears on his final payment receipt. Dated March 25th, 1432, nearly 1 full year after Joan's execution, he is paid 111 livres and 13 sols for executing 104 French soldiers who had attempted to capture Rouen Castle. The irony is staggering and complete. The man who burned the Maid of Orléans ends his career killing French patriots who were trying to liberate her city. After this date, Geoffroy Terrage vanishes from all historical records. Whether he died of natural causes, fled from his guilt, or simply changed his name and profession remains unknown. The executioner who destroyed Joan of Arc cannot bear to remain in history. His disappearance adds to her legend while erasing his own story. Some truths are simply too heavy for mortal men to carry. Pierre Cosquel, the master mason, begins to collect physical evidence of Joan's sanctity. Before the execution scaffold is completely dismantled and burned, he gathers fragments of the blood and smoke-stained wood. He preserves a piece of the rope that was used to bind her to the stake. He collects stones that were scorched black by her pyre. These objects, these humble relics, are carefully catalogued, wrapped, and preserved. They will later provide powerful, tangible support for her canonization process. Saints require relics, and believers, in their faith, create them immediately. The Dominican friars compile their sworn testimonies about Joan's final hours, accounts that directly and devastatingly contradict the English propaganda. Martin Ladvenu describes her pious and heartfelt confession on the morning of her execution. Isambard de la Pierre details her astonishing forgiveness of her enemies while standing on the stake. Jean Massieu recounts her final, desperate request for the sight of a crucifix. Their collected accounts, all sworn under holy oath, will later form the core of the evidence that destroys the heresy verdict. Truth preserves itself in the sanctity of a sworn testimony. By 1433, 2 years after her execution, Joan's transformation from condemned heretic to venerated saint is irreversible. Too many witnesses have spoken the truth, too many secret testimonies have been recorded, too many miracles have been reported and believed. The English can deny the evidence, but they cannot erase it. They can spread their propaganda, but they cannot silence the human conscience. Truth has achieved a critical mass, and it has become an unstoppable force. Charles VII begins his own private inquiries into Joan's trial by 1435, 4 years after her death. The king cannot yet officially rehabilitate her without admitting his own catastrophic failure to protect her, but he can gather the evidence for future use. Royal agents are dispatched to begin collecting testimonies about the trial's corruption. Loyal servants are tasked with preserving the witness statements. The formal rehabilitation begins informally, secretly, through royal initiative. Justice, long delayed, is now being meticulously prepared. Guillaume Manchon outlives most of the other trial participants, surviving for 25 years to become the star witness at Joan's official rehabilitation trial. The chief notary who had recorded her original testimony provides devastating, irrefutable evidence of English corruption and gross judicial misconduct. His contemporaneous notes, preserved in secret for a quarter of a century, prove that the trial was fraudulent from its very beginning to its fiery end. The patient truth-tellers, in the fullness of time, become the most powerful witnesses. Pierre Cauchon dies suddenly of heart failure on December 15th. 1442, 11 years after Joan's execution and 13 years before her ultimate vindication. The bishop who condemned her never lives to see his verdict officially overturned, but he dies knowing that his legacy is crumbling daily. The witnesses to his corruption multiply with each passing year. His reputation dies long before his body does. Divine justice, it would seem, keeps its own inexorable schedule. When Charles VII finally retakes the city of Rouen in November of 1449, 18 years after Joan's execution, one of his first official acts is to order a full investigation into her trial. The king, who failed to save her in life, finally moves to clear her name in death. Political necessity has finally overcome personal cowardice. Military victory has at last enabled moral courage. Better late than never. Justice arrives with the liberating army. The rehabilitation trial opens in November of 1455, armed with an unprecedented mountain of documentation. Over 100 witnesses testify to Joan's innocence and her prosecutor's guilt. An aged Guillaume Manchon presents his secret French notes, proving the trial's manipulation beyond any doubt. Jean Massieu describes the English intimidation of witnesses in vivid detail. The Dominican friars testify to Joan's profound sanctity and martyrdom. Pierre Cosquel produces the physical evidence of corruption he had gathered from the execution site itself. Truth, so long delayed, has become a truth so overwhelming it cannot be denied. On July 7th, 1456, 25 years, 1 month, and 8 days after Joan's execution, a panel of papal judges declares her completely and utterly innocent of all charges. Before a cheering crowd in Rouen, they physically tear up the articles of her condemnation. They order a cross of honor to be erected at her execution site. They formally declare her original trial to be tainted by fraud, calumny, wickedness, contradictions, and manifest errors of fact and law. The rehabilitation is absolute. The vindication is total. Justice comes slowly, but it comes completely. Pope Calixtus III annuls Joan's sentence entirely, declaring it null, void, and of no effect. The heretic officially becomes a martyr. The witch officially becomes a saint. The condemned woman becomes a national heroine of France. Her prosecutors are condemned in the historical record as corrupt. Her judges are judged by history as criminals. Her executioners are, in turn, executed by history. But this great victory does not truly begin in 1456 with a papal proclamation. It begins on May 31st. 1431, a mere 24 hours after her death, when the first terrified witness whispered the single word that would echo through the centuries, martyr. Joan of Arc's rehabilitation does not start with legal proceedings decades later. It starts immediately. In the executioner's terror, the notary's guilt, the friar's conviction, and the mason's questions, truth emerges instantly from the ashes of lies. Innocence declares itself long before any judge is willing to recognize it. Sanctity proclaims itself despite the official condemnation of the Church. The heart that survived 3 burnings becomes the perfect metaphor for the truth that survives all persecution. The woman who died blessing her enemies becomes the saint who blesses France forever. The execution intended to end her story instead begins her immortal legend. The fire that was meant to destroy her instead purifies her memory for all time. 24 hours after Joan of Arc burns at the stake in Rouen's marketplace, she rises from the ashes her enemies thought they had scattered in the Seine. The death that was intended to prove her guilt instead proves her innocence for all to see. The silence imposed by her execution instead amplifies her voice across the centuries. Joan of Arc dies a condemned heretic at noon on May 30th, 1431. She is reborn an acknowledged saint in the hearts of her people by noon on May 31st. The transformation takes exactly 24 hours, the same amount of time Christ is said to have spent in the tomb before his resurrection. The parallel is not coincidental. It is essential. Both died innocent. Both were vindicated by a truth that could not stay buried. Both rose again, stronger in death than they had ever been in life. The English burned Joan's body 3 times, but they could not burn the truth. They scattered her ashes in the river Seine, but they could not scatter her memory. They executed her to end the French resistance, but in doing so, they created the eternal symbol that would drive them from France forever. Joan of Arc wins her final, greatest victory not on the field of battle, but in the battle for the human heart. And 24 hours after her execution, that victory began its unstoppable march through history.